I been teaching occasionally at the KDI School of Public Policy and KDI School of Public Policy and Management, which is in Sejong City. And there I made the proposal a couple of years ago that we at the KDI School produce a MOOC course, massive open online course, to introduce the Korea's development experiences for the interested people from developing countries. And they agreed, and then I had to had to have a talk with Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University in order to have his support for my proposal to have that MOOC, once produced, uploaded on the so-called SDG Academy platform, which is a subsidiary of the UN SDSN, of which I am a member. So he agreed. So with his support, the KDI launched this preparation of the production of this MOOC on Korea's development experiences, and it took close to 2 years to produce the MOOC, which consists of about 10 or so modules highlighting Korea's development experiences in specific fields for development, such as education, public health, transportation, the Semaul Undong, the environmental development, and so on. And I served as the main advisor for that project to the KDI school. And so that MOOC was produced under my guidance. And that MOOC has gone online in October last year, and it is still being shown. And in support of that MOOC, we also decided to write books to elaborate our video lectures uploaded on that MOOC. And so we also went into writing individual chapters, and I was responsible for writing the overall overview chapter, the comprehensive overview chapter, reviewing Korea's whole period of modernization and economic development since the 1950s. And so we now have that book published, and I'm going to provide the copies to 3 of my colleagues over here. I have brought them here. And so what I'm going to do today is to present the key, the contents of that comprehensive chapter or review of Korea's modern economic development experiences, which is basically known in the international community as Korea's economic development, Korea's economic miracle. And we at the KDI school have been receiving so many requests for clarification, for information, and for courses on Korea's development experiences. So this MOOC is supposed to serve as the main framework of reference for those foreign students coming to KDI school to learn about Korea's development experiences. Now, so let me talk about this, and of course the objective in this exercise is to derive possible lessons from Korea's development experiences for developing countries. And so at the end of this presentation, I'm going to focus on what are the possibly available lessons to be derived from South Korean development experiences. Now, this is the book, and here I have reviewed the preconditions before Korea's takeoff, which happened in the early 1960s, and the preconditions basically well, the conditions which kept Koreans trapped in extreme poverty, and but that story goes back all the way back to the early centuries of Korea's pre-modern agrarian society of Lee dynasty, and which was then followed by the colonialization by the Imperial Japan, whose main interest in Korea was to exploit Korea's agricultural and natural resources. And then Korea was liberated at the end of the Second World War, but then Korea's war dragged into political and ideological turmoil immediately after liberation between pro-communist socialist ideologues and the pro-market conservative intellectuals. And that led to the launch of the two governments, two countries on the Korean peninsula. That happened in 1948, but that was soon followed by the Korean War, which of course devastated the economy. And then after the end of the war, we had several years of post-war reconstruction, which was basically dependent on the generous development assistance from the United States. But then very soon, toward the end of the 50s, United States announced gradual withdrawal of this post-construction aid, while Korea was suffering from a very serious inflationary pressure. And so that led to the stagnation of the Korean economy toward the end of the 1950s. In the meantime, the founding president of Korea, Republic of Korea, Syngman Rhee, should be credited for having established a capitalist economy, and also he how should I say, followed the policy of very staunch anti-communism, and he in particular secured a strong alliance relationship with the United States, and that very strong military alliance with the United States, I think, is probably the most important foundation for Korea's economic miracle, although economists often forget to mention this fact. And but on the other hand, Syngman Rhee turned into an incompetent authoritarian president, and he was surrounded by many corrupt cronies who rigged the third presidential election to re-elect Syngman Rhee, and that led to the student protest, and which toppled the Syngman Rhee government, and that was, of course, the April 19th student revolution. And this was followed briefly by a new democratic government, which, however, turned out to be also very incompetent, and which was immediately embroiled within infighting among the politicians. And so this gave an excuse for Park Chung-hee to intervene with a military coup. Of course, nowadays, I think the conservatives would like to call this a military revolution, whereas the progressives would still like to call that as merely a military coup. Anyway, my point here is that throughout the 50s up to the early 60s, Korea was politically unstable. The economy lacked dynamism, and people remained very destitute and remained dejected. The poverty rate in those days was something like closely came to 70% or so. Very, very poor. You young people here would be surprised to hear this, but in those days, the Korean streets are roamed with beggars who carry empty cans to beg for food, especially boiled rice, which went bad, and kimchi that went very bad, they nonetheless begged for that. So that was a very typical scene in Korea in those days. Now, however, what happened after Park Chung-hee launched a new government after following his military coup, and this graph shows the path of Korea's income, the growth of Korea's income over time, and it looks like this. Our per capita was something like, capital GNP was like $90 or so as of 1962, and however, as of 2017, it has reached this level of $38,000 or so. So this rapid growth of the Korean economy is often referred to as Korea's compressed development. And look at this graph, which shows the rate of absolute poverty, which was, look at the big bar, and that's the national poverty rate, was something like 58% as of 1961, and that came down to less than 8% by 1993. Huge drop in the poverty rate. Now, the Nobel laureate economist Angus Deaton wrote a book under the title of Great Escape, and he was discussing the absolute poverty problems of today's very low-income countries, and he was explaining why it is so difficult for those countries to escape that poverty, and he therefore talks about great escape in reference to the possible escape from the absolute poverty that today's developing countries suffering from. Well, he was not referring to the Korean experiences, but I think Korea in fact achieved this great escape. This whole downward graph attests to that. And look at the urban poverty ratio, which was 70% in 1961. Huge. Korea was so huge. And today's young people would not imagine.
Is there a typo there? It says rural from 38% in 61 to a higher number of 87% in 93. Is that untrue, or is that just a typo in the title there?
I think that urban poverty was higher.
But the rural goes up, right?
Rural, no. You should come, the 8. We don't need that 8 here.
It should be 7.
Just a 7.
Okay, just a clarification on that slide. Okay.
And then we made another great escape, which is escape from authoritarian or dictatorship of the Park Chung-hee government. And this began with this big march of early June 1987. And recently there was a movie, blockbuster movie made out of this under the title of 1987. And so this is what happened in those days. And this forced...
That's a great photo.
Yeah, that forced Chun Doo-han, then the authoritarian ruler, to succumb to the popular demand for the implementation of the completely free presidential election toward the end of that year, and he had to.
That was a pivotal moment politically. That was also the month that the Ministry of Communications declared completion of a nationwide public switched telephone network, the first digital network in Korea that month.
Now here I have looked at the average economic growth rate per decade. So conveniently, for the purpose of analysis, the major demarcation in Korea's development path took place around the end of a decade, each decade. So this shows how it happened. So the growth rate for the 60s was close to 9%, and then another 9% for the second period of 70s, and it was even greater the 1980s. And the growth rate falls somewhat in the 1990s. And in the and then beginning at around 2000 or so, Korean economy sort of slows down to the pace of a developed country, in the sense of recording such a lowered growth rate like 5% or below since 2000 or so. So this shows you that Korea indeed had a record of spectacular growth performance in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even up to the early part of the 1990s. Now, so I have looked at the Korea's development history by decade, and I could identify or characterize the economic policies followed in each decade, roughly in each decade, in this manner. First, the first one is the expression, which is a quotation from the pledge of revolutionary pledge issued by Park Chung-hee to justify his coup d'etat. And there I think this is sort of a key point. He says that Koreans are struggling in despair, on the verge of starvation. And this, in fact, was the popular sentiment which prevailed in those days among Koreans. And that sort of a sense of destitution continued up to the early 1960s. Then Park Chung-hee intervened and established a new government, and thanks to his policies, Korean economy took off in the 1960s, and the keynote of the policies he pursued in that period can be sort of expressed as one of exporting to build a self-reliant economy. Export drive was the main pillar of his policies. And in the 1970s, he shifted his policy, weight of his policies toward investment, strategic investment in heavy and chemical industries. Korea was investing in heavy and chemical industries even in the 1960s. But Park Chung-hee sort of doubled down on that route of promotion of heavy and chemical industries, and he mobilized a massive investment in several industrial sectors identified as heavy and chemical industries. But this promotion, the government-led export drive, followed by an extraordinarily heavy emphasis on investment in heavy chemical industries, sort of turned the Korean economy into a government-managed economy. I describe it as one of paternalistic government. The government, with the president at the helm, dictated everything. He determined, he made the key decision, he showed the way, and he told the people to follow, and in fact, most of the Koreans just followed his leadership. So Korea had a deeply, how do I say, one which deeply intervenes. How do I express that?
Yeah, paternalistic government. My question, Soogil,
yeah.
How much did the fact that President Park had been assassinated how much did that have to do with allowing people like you and Om Young and
I'll
others?
come to that, yes, please.
Okay.
Just wait, So anyway, there was a fundamental change in in the way the government interacted with the private sector at around the end of the 70s and early 1980s. So there is a major fundamental shift from a government-managed economy toward a private sector-led economy. And there were three major key economic reforms which were pushed forcefully and which were implemented very effectively under President Chun Doo-hwan, largely because Chun Doo-hwan delegated all responsibilities for economic policies to his staff, which were headed by a particular person known as Kim Jae-ik. And he was comes from the same school year of Gyeonggi High School with Oh Myung. And at that time,
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that
yeah,
before.
Oh Myung was one of those who were recruited into his team. But the point here is that Chun Doo-hwan said, I don't know anything about economics. He told Kim Jae-ik, you are the economic president. I will leave everything in your hands, so that he faithfully followed that pledge. So free from political influence as a result, Kim Jae-ik and his team were able to pursue, and most of them were US trained economists and engineers. So whereas Park Chung-hee himself was formerly an army officer of the Japanese army, and he was basically in his instinct and in whatever he knew about how to run the economy, basically were ingrained, were the
Command economy, kind of
the rather faithfully followed what the Japanese had been doing. So Japan was our teacher, as it were, to him. So, but Japan, as you know, is a very a country run by the bureaucrats and with heavy intervention by the government. And so that was the nature of the government, basically, that Park Chung-hee ran. But with his death passing away, the Korean officials were free to break away from the Park Chung-hee's traditional policies.
That's fascinating, because I think that also helps to explain why Korea moved ahead of Japan in electronics. Yeah.
Dr. Young,
And yeah.
how much was the government empowered by access to Eurodollars, petrodollars, and other sources of international finance at this time? Did that give the government some leverage in sort of moving the economy?
Bank of Korea blocked off all international lending. Is that correct?
Korea, first of all, had been running deficits on the current account, including, of course, a trade account, up to the mid-1980s. So Korea was always running short of dollars. So Korea was a heavy borrower in the international market, to such an extent that at the end of the 1970s, Korea was the fourth largest indebted developing country. In part, that was aggravated by the second oil shock, which took place in 1978 or so. So Korea was heavily indebted. That in turn sort of motivated or forced Korea to make special efforts to infiltrate the construction market of the Middle East. And as you know, Middle East was booming because of their huge oil dollar income following the first oil shock in 1974. And that basically provided a springboard for Hyundai chairman Jung Ju-young. But anyway, so Korea was doing very well in earning oil money, as you said, and that was, of course, recycled into the Korean domestic economy in a significant measure to finance investment in heavy and chemical industries. But then also the rest had to be used for the purpose of financing whatever huge input that we had to make in terms of machinery and consumer goods and all that. So despite that income, huge income inflow of oil dollar, Korea was still borrowing. But then we experienced that there was this international debt crisis at the end of the 70s because of the second oil shock, and that second oil shock, of course, also triggered a global recession, beginning in the United States. So there was a global recession accompanied by this international debt crisis, and so as a result, Korea was driven into a major economic crisis at the end of the 70s because this oil shock, because of the international debt crisis, and that also coincided with the high rise in international interest rates, which was led by the monetary policy of the United States at the time. So Korea was very much hard pressed at this time, and so there was a sense of crisis gripped Koreans, and Korean government was looking for a way out, and that coincided with the death of Park Chung-hee, and then this economic bureaucrats led by Kim Jae-ik looked for a package, implemented a package of economic reforms, including very strong anti-inflationary policy and strengthening of the competition among Korean firms in the form of introducing introducing competition law, and the third one, and probably the most important, was one of launching a 5 years programs of market opening, trade liberalization in terms of removing import restrictions, plus bringing down the rates of tariffs. And I was one of those who joined that team led by Kim Jae-ik, and so through that opportunity I befriended Ho Myung, who was my high school senior anyway, and I in particular was responsible for triggering national debates about the need for trade liberalization, and I in fact also provided the government with a major blueprint on how to go about liberalizing the trade in the form of both import liberalization and tariff reductions, and my recommendations were more or less rather totally implemented by the government throughout the 1980s.
I got one follow-up financial question. At one time, the Chaebol were denied the right to borrow internationally. Is that true, or is this? I read somewhere the Bank of Korea controlled a lot of and blocked off a lot of private borrowing of the Chaebol and was kept.
Chaebol,
and that's part of the
first
trade.
of all,
okay.
Korean capital market was remained closed to direct investment from abroad.
Okay.
Because the government had an interest in nurturing Korea's own international competitiveness, making their businesses as a champion, national champions. So they did not want to dilute the ownership
I see.
and the management rights of those major corporations and investments in favor of foreign investors. So, but Korean government encouraged and made efforts to borrow from international market. Of course, the government would supervise their operations, but the borrowing was made. But the Chaebol, they wanted to borrow rather than welcome foreign direct investment.
Correct.
So in that way, there was a much inflow of foreign debt in those days, and that was a contributor, of course, for making Korea heavily internationally indebted. So this drastic shift in the policy directions away from Park Chung-hee's regime towards one, which was championed by Kim Jae-il, that constituted the dismantling of a paternalistic government in those days. And then that in turn was followed by a historic shift to a current account surplus beginning in 1985. Until that time, since our very early childhood, Koreans were told that it is people's patriotic duty not to consume foreign goods, to consume domestic goods. So we used to carry a small, ribbon here, which says love Korean, made in Korean products, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sentiment of avoiding consumption of foreign goods was sort of ingrained into our national value systems. And my proposal of trade liberalization came as a big shock to the Koreans in general, because I was saying that not consuming foreign goods has nothing to do with patriotism. I was saying that sentiment and protection of domestic market against the foreign competition merely makes Korean businessmen, producers, industrialists, and so on, make them complacent, relying on protection rather than on innovations. And therefore I was saying that this market opening measure and getting rid of that protectionist impulse.
They should have listened to you more carefully.
Well,
Because
is that still a problem? They have listened to
years
me.
years later, Korea was 2.5 years late in introducing the smartphone because of somewhat similar sentiments, I think. We can talk later about
Okay,
that.
that's about a specific industrial policy.
Dr. Yang
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
very early proponent of,
So that is
Yeah.
the price stabilization, the promoting fair competition in the domestic economy, especially between big businesses and small and medium enterprises, and market trade liberalization all contributed to enhance the international competitiveness of Korea's industries and expose the heavy and chemical industries to international competition as well. And that all, plus we had a very fortuitous coincidence of three very happy developments that happened to the Korean economy. First, there was something called the Plaza Agreement in September 1985, as a result of which advanced countries agreed to devalue US dollar against Japanese currency, yen, by about 50%. The Korean currency was more or less pegged to, not pegged, but remained quite closely anchored to US dollar. So that decision led to the huge devaluation of Korean currency against Japanese yen. That in turn boosted the price competitiveness of Korean industry by about 50% or something like that. Korean products became very competitive in the international market as a result. So that sort of shows you the double role that Japanese economy was playing vis-a-vis the Korean economy, and in contribution to Korea's development as a teacher, as well as a formidable competitor. Anyway, so finally we were free of concerns about shortage of foreign exchanges. In fact, in those days, the then economic deputy prime minister Kim Man-jae was always smiling as we walked around. He was so happy with the continuing huge inflow of dollars. So his only worry, he would joke, say that my only problem is I don't know how to spend these foreign dollars, foreign currency changes. So that's what happened. And so, I'm losing March.
No.
Oh, Anthony. So So that's what happened, and that was a historic event. And then, the government began to tell the people to consume foreign products. That was a response to the international trade pressure from President Reagan and so on, and all that happy economic events, of course, facilitated and coincided with the democratization, which was triggered by that massive demonstrations in June 1987, and so finally Korea made the second great escape from political underdevelopment toward democracy. So then, this democracy, however, was followed by a new spell of political instabilities and sort of class infightings between workers on the one hand and on the big corporations. Because as a result of democracy, now labor unions had been suppressed all along by Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. Now they were now free to speak up what they want, and they were demanding sort of how do I say, retribution?
Distribution?
Yeah, for
participation in policy?
For compensation, as it were,
Okay.
for what they sacrificed under the authoritarian governments. So they were at the forefront of the fight by the general population for better distribution, for human rights, labor rights, and all of those rights which had been suppressed beforehand. And that created a lot of social and political turmoil, which destabilized the government. And the government was in a defensive position, and it kept increasing expenditures, budgetary expenditures for social development, for the purpose of sort of pacifying the general population who were demanding greater equity, more investment for social development, and so on. And that in turn created a room for a financial crisis. So there came the financial crisis in 1990, at the end of 1997 and through the 1998. And so Korea had to struggle to overcome that financial crisis, which brought down the Korea's growth rate from 6% or so to -1% or something like that in 1998. And Korea's income measured in dollars fell from something like, the exact figure is here, but something like from 13,000 or so to less than $8,000 as a matter of few months.
Just before you arrived, we pointed out that there are only 2 times that the growth rate, economic growth rate, went into negative territory. 1980 and this period.
Yeah.
Well, twice. It's very striking.
The 1980.
Always growing.
The economic crisis at the end of the 1970s were a result of multiple causes, including the second oil shock, the death of President Park, which led to political instabilities, and then the impact, recessionary impact of an excessive investment made in heavy and chemical industries by Park Chung-hee throughout the 1970s. And then there was also the political crisis following the death of Park Chung-hee was made worse by the emergence of Chun Doo-hwan, who claimed to be a successor to Park Chung-hee, and he sort of quelled all the emergent desires for democratization, which was followed the death of Park Chung-hee. So he brought back the authoritarian, repressive political order, and that created this turmoil in the form of Gwangju, Gwangju uprising, and the following the bloody response by Chun Doo-hwan to that Gwangju uprising. And then there was this very serious cold weather spell in early August to 1980, and as a result of that, Korea lost 1/4 of the anticipated rice crop of that year. An unprecedented tragedy, and that forced the Korean government to scramble to secure rice from abroad under a sense of crisis. So anyway, that led to, also contributed to the sharp drop in the economic growth rate. So that's why we had the negative growth rate in 1980. But
That's fascinating.
But this one that we had here in 1998 was more serious in the sense that this crisis, the second crisis, was embedded in the structural problems of the Korean economy, whereas the earlier one was much also due to the external events.
I was living here then, and the IMF restaurants sprung up. IMF was everywhere.
Right.
In 1997, 98.
There was a huge chain of bankruptcies among Korean big businesses, including Daewoo Group.
Yeah.
But then it was even more severe among small and medium enterprises, and the rate of unemployment shot up. And so this financial crisis at the time provided Koreans, ordinary Koreans, with sort of a trauma of having to struggle to scrape by to feed themselves. I have many of my friends whose businesses collapsed as a result of this.
They brought gold. They brought their jewelry and donated to help the country.
But unlike the Greek, who was reacting in the way that they did to the financial crisis in recent years, especially under the new presidency of Kim Dae-jung, Korea sort of embraced this IMF prescribed package for a very fundamental package of reforms, including financial reforms, with bravado. And Kim Dae-jung said that we would take advantage of this crisis in order to shift get rid of all the poor, bad legacies of the paternalistic government that still lingered. And so this Korean government used this financial crisis as an occasion to overcome the opposition from the vested interest groups in favor of a major financial reforms, corporate reforms, including, of course, bringing down the Daewoo Group, the fourth largest chaebol group at the time, and Korea's most extensively internationally exposed business group at the time. And so we sort of set right many of what seemed to be wrong up to that time. Those were the problems that Korean economists, including myself, had been arguing for all the time, but there was also this pushback from the business sector as well as from the bureaucrats. So that's why we had to wait until the crisis to implement all those reforms, and that reform worked because they came in the form of a very forceful advice from the IMF, while the bailout money from IMF was made available conditional upon Korea's implementation of those reform packages. And Korea, Kim Dae-jung in particular, even in fact went further than as was asked by the IMF in reforming the Korean economy. So he used the expression IMF plus reforms. That's how we rose up to the challenge. But then I say in my paper that we have finally gotten rid of all the remaining legacies of a paternalistic government-led managed economy, so that we have finally went through a rite of passage to the status of a developed country. And this happened as we overcame the financial crisis in those years. So that's when we shedded the final legacy of a paternalistic government. Now, what happened afterwards? This is a review. I'm not going into this, into analysis of this, but these are what happened, major events that happened in the last decade. Korea emerged as a global competitor in high-tech industries. Korea was in particular, rose as a world-class digital economy, of which Jim, I think, is one of the few leading experts in Korea. Korea became the 12th largest economy and the 5th largest trader, and Korea also emerged as a pathfinder of green growth strategy for the world. Korea joined the G20 group in 2009 as the group was launched here. Korea joined the OECD Development Assistance Committee as a donor for developing countries. And then, as we all know, Korean pop culture, including drama and pop songs, rose as a new global culture. And then here is something else. We had that Sewol ferry boat tragedy in 2015?
2014.
14, was it? Yeah, okay,
yeah.
Okay, you know better. Very good. And then in 2 years after that, I think we had this candlelight demonstrations, or what Moon Jae-in would rather call candlelight revolution. And I think this sort of puts the Korean economy on a completely different path looking forward. And we are still struggling to define how that path forward. But a major upshot of those two events has been that Korean people, once empowered in 1987, was empowered again as a result of those two events. And then we have this nuclearized, the DPRK. In the meantime, the global order has been undergoing a tremendous fundamental upheaval. All these challenges poses challenges, and here is my point looking forward about Korea. Korea today is at a point of inflection, facing many serious new challenges, economic, social, environmental, and international, in part as a result of social political consequences. Some of those problems, which apparently are very challenging, remain challenging even to this day, originate from the history of compressed development, which was led by the authoritarian government. It was responsible for economic miracle, but it is also responsible for many problems we are suffering from right now. So we have to chart a new path for development. I say new path for sustainable development, and this is what has been my concern, my personal concern in late years. But let's go back to the review of the whole experiences. I'm not going into the detailed explanations of those policies which happened by decade, but here are the summary analysis. One is, first, what were the secrets for Korea's economic miracle? I mentioned the national security owed to United support. We also, I credited Lee Seung-man for embracing a market-based capitalism when he was writing up the constitution. Then there was important measure taken in the late 40s actually. It's the political social stabilization of the rural population with forced dismantlement of the agricultural land load system, which had been inherited from Lee dynasty as well as from the Japanese colonial era. And the Korea introduced the principle of farmers' ownership of farmland. No absentee farmers, and then the existing farmland was allocated. It was actually sold at a very low price to farmers within a ceiling allocated per for the rural farm household. And that gave a sense of ownership about this capitalist economy among rural population, which at that time accounted for more than 60% of Koreans in those days. And without that, I don't think we could have secured popular support for capitalist system. And then we had early emphasis on the universal primary education, and there was a very effective, widespread illiteracy eradication campaign. But then more strategic elements are listed here. The clear vision for national development, an effective and inspiring leadership provided by Park Chung-hee, and he, among others, adopted as a primary principle an outward-oriented industrial development strategy. And then he set up an effective economic governance system. I will not go into those details here. And then through the 5-year plans as well as 10-year plans by sector, including in the technological sector, Korea never neglected in investing in capabilities for long-term development. And also, Korean government built many think tanks, including KDI, for example, which basically were made of foreign-trained brains, including economists like myself from the United States, in the form of KDI, KIST, and so on. We nowadays have so many specialized governmental think tanks.
On that, KIST, which originally was KAIS without the T, they have a hall there named Terman Hall after Frederick Terman, who was the provost, was the dean of engineering at Stanford and became provost. He headed an international committee that came over and advised the Park Chung-hee government, and now KIST is,
What year was that, where that advising structure was? 70s?
I forgot to mention that, but yes, there was KIST, K-I-A-I-S, that was in 1967 or something like that.
Right.
And then T was added later, becoming KIST.
That's fascinating. Stanford connection in the 60s there, even before miniaturization of technology.
We owe much of all these brain powers, including especially the tech engineers and scientists, to the United States support. And this one is important. As I said, we introduced a very broad package of reforms at the time of the crisis at the end of the 70s, and then we also introduced a very deep-cutting package of reforms on the time of the financial crisis, and this shows that we used major crises to launch paradigm-shifting reforms. And interestingly, each of those major reforms coincided with a change of political leader. We were lucky, but then we had the good leaders in that regard.
That's interesting because you could consider the assassination of President Park Chung-hee to be a crisis, and that was only his death that allowed, for example, the introduction of color television broadcasting.
We don't say it aloud, even to this day, but I think his death was one of the best things that happened at the time, despite the tragic dimension of it. But anyway, I'm not going to tell you.
I've never seen this articulated that way, but that's very interesting as a factor.
And then here I take pains to explain that developing countries should not try to emulate the Korea's authoritarian approach to development, because much of the success was due to the merits of personal merits of Park Chung-hee himself, not to the fact that he was the authoritarian leader. So what my point is that if you in any country would elect an authoritarian leader, he's unlikely to have that personal merits that Park Chung-hee had. So it was by historical luck and accident that we had Park Chung-hee. So anyway. anyway, so don't try to emulate Korean experiences.
Good point. Yushin. I was here at Kangwon-taehak for Yushin. Never forget in my life.
Mm.
Yeah.
But then Park Chung-hee was enabled to play the role that he did because of his authoritarian control.
Mhm.
But here I'm saying that today the authoritarianism is no longer available basically in developing countries or as in developed countries, and the main the good initiatives undertaken by Park Chung-hee can be emulated under democracy by principles of good governance. So I come to that as well in my paper. What are necessary arrangements to enable the kind of a leadership that Park Chung-hee played under democracy? And then so here I talk about several bad consequences of South Korea's authoritarian approach, and that which still I think haunt us today, belatedly. But I'm not going to that, of course. I'm actually should round up my. Okay, here. What are the lessons for developing countries? Here, just give a quick look at those bold-faced types here. So, and what else? This is the second part of that. And I emphasize the need that make the point that a crisis bound to confront the countries, and when that happens, make use of that as an opportunity to change the status quo. So do not shun criticisms, always keep open eyes to criticisms on the part of the government, of course, and try to critically reassess the current policies and look for room to improve the existing policies. And this authoritarian approach to economic development, forget about it, but introduce good governance arrangements which would embody the principles that, for example, a war implemented by Park Chung-hee. And so I say that this is my conclusion: democracy is both an eventual outcome of economic development and a necessary condition for long-term economic development. Over the first part of this sentence, I'm saying that if whatever with approach you succeed with economic development, then that will bring about forces for democratization, so that one way or another existing authoritarian regime will collapse. And for example, China, I don't think China can go on indefinitely on this path under Xi Jinping's authoritarian leadership.
That point resonates strongly with digital development, because
Sure.
the introduction
Absolutely.
of fax machines on the ISDN, or the first digital network, helped the opposition to Chun-Doo-hwan and helped move toward.
So here I say that how we can, developing countries may think of applying the lessons over here to their efforts to pursue sustainable development under the 17 SDGs provided by the United Nations. And so there has never been an economist analysis of Korean experiences by Korean economists looking both into economic as well as political dimensions. And this is sort of a first of such attempt to integrate economic considerations and political considerations. And I think, therefore, I end up with conclusions about the importance of democracy. So, well, I have come to the end of my lecture. I'm very sorry that I was so late. We could have used more time for more discussions.
But thank you, Dr. Yang.
And as I promised, I have this.
Well, oh, okay. 고맙습니다.
Thank you. and,
Thank you.
just
Are there any
maybe-
questions from other people right now?
Yeah, we had questions throughout. Do you have any questions for Dr.
Thank you very much.
Those guys have never heard about Korea before.
That's right.
You don't know anything about Korea, do you? I'm joking.
We can end it too officially, or nothing is really bothering me to ask questions. What's your schedule, Dr.
I
Young?
have to.
You have to go. Okay.
Class at 2:00.
Okay, I see. Well, then we'll break it right now. I'm really glad we could make the talk worthwhile, and I'm sure this will begin some other discussions. But I would say not only political and economic, but I was thinking along the line, I would add an environmental level, particularly to the democratization movement in the 80s and the way that was connected from what I have read.
Yeah.
We can discuss things like that.
There is a module chapter there about Korea's environmental development
Okay.
at the end of the book.
All right. Thank you very much, and appreciate it. Yay.
And just having lived here during part of what Dr. Yang was explaining, I think
Professor Larson
his
is part of
presentation-
Korea's modern history.
his-
Yeah.
Well, you get older and you become an historian,
Mhm.
but I just want to say it's full of some wisdom and also based on his personal experience, and I'd like to personally thank him. I'd like to I'll get a copy of your slides from Mark.
Okay.
Sure.
And,
Okay.
thank you very much for the.
By the way,
Yeah.
I said that I contributed as a main trigger of economic, the opening
Right.
of Korea.
Mhm.
In the 1990s, a major reform of a far more far-reaching consequences was the financial transparency reform
Right.
under the name of real name
Name.
financial transactions reform,
Yes.
which was implemented by Kim Young-sam.
And you.
And I was the provider of the idea of how to go about doing that to him.
You were the
I'm
beneficial
responsible
Machiavelli.
for two of the
Yeah.
most consequential
Yeah.
reforms of Korea.
Professor
Yeah.
Young, I have to talk with you about that.
Okay.
We need an hour or two.
Yeah.
Because that dovetails throughout. I was just checking off points in the digital technology development and how it came to drive Korea's economy. So this is very interesting.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Okay.
Take a drink with you if you need it. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So you are here. She's my assistant.